Welcome to the MIT New Colossus Project. I am Raafet Azzouz, the founder of the project. This show is fostering a narrative of excellence. I will have conversation with extraordinary individuals who all have one thing in common. They were not born in America, but built something outstanding here. This show dives into the exceptional life journey of every one of our guests, rewriting the narrative about immigration one conversation at a time. Today, I'm thrilled to bring you an inspiring conversation with a visionary who embodies innovation, entrepreneurship, and the power of immigrant contribution, Noubar Afeyan. Noubar is the founder and CEO of Flagship Pioneering, the company behind more than 100 groundbreaking ventures tackling humanity's biggest challenges in health and sustainability. Guided by a belief in asking bold what-if questions, Flagship has created transformative companies like Moderna, where Noubar serves as its co-founder and the chairman of its board. Flagship has created more than $60 billion of value since its creation, thousands of patents, and over 50 drugs in clinical development. His impact on biotechnology has been monumental. He's a passionate advocate for the contribution of immigrants to economic and scientific progress, and he has been honored with the Golden Door Award as well as the Carnegie Corporation Great Immigrant Honor. He's a proud member of the MIT family, where he earned his PhD in biochemical engineering in 1987, who laid the foundation for his career. He also shaped the next generation of innovators as a lecturer at MIT and also at Harvard Business School. Join me as we explore Noubar's remarkable story. If you want to support our work at New Colossus, please subscribe to our YouTube and Spotify channel. Let's dive in. Good morning, Noubar. How are you doing today?
Very well.
Awesome. It's great to have you on this 7th episode of the New Colossus Project. The New Colossus Project, as you know, is telling the stories of trailblazing immigrants who came to America to achieve extraordinary things. And we try to learn from your insights and your journey, but also we try to inspire the next generation of brilliant minds who come to America and who call America their new home. So I would love actually to start before Flagship, before Moderna, before MIT. So you were born in Lebanon, in Beirut, from Armenian parents. You came to Canada first at the age of 13, then you moved to the US to pursue your PhD in biochemical engineering at MIT. So I just want to ask you, when you were a kid, what was your image of America coming here? I mean, despite the temperature shock, which was pretty steep.
Yes. Well, look, Beirut, Lebanon was an unusual place because when it was peaceful, it was really, they used to call it the Paris of the Middle East. It was very kind of multicultural. There was just a lot of foreigners there all the time, and it was it was a party town, although I was too young to benefit from it. But it was just this kind of very special intersection of a lot of interesting kind of people and forces. And so kind of, I thought that's what normal looks like until it all stopped. Growing up, my exposure to America was, on television and movies. In fact, Lebanon was a place where they used to try new movies, even before they were released, just to get audience reactions and stuff. So we often got movies very, very early on, which I didn't know, but that turns out to be the case. The music, we used to have lots of times, the U.S. Embassy used to bring a lot of bands, and so I saw rock music, this and that growing up, and it was kind of fun to see it live. So it was really mostly kind of like a dream kind of state, what it must be like in the US, etc. I had also heard of MIT growing up, and unusually in the science kind of math type of fields, which I was interested in at a fairly young age. MIT was viewed to be the world's, by far best university. So growing up, I probably heard of MIT before I heard of Harvard, which is unusual. But and in Beirut, there was a big contingent of people who had been to MIT, and there was it influenced me over time.
Yeah. And what was it like? So this was your image, right, before coming here, and obviously you came to Canada and then you moved to the US. What was the reality of you coming as an undergrad and then a grad to MIT, right, and to Boston and Cambridge? What was the reality of you, Noubar, being in the US, being in Canada, being in North America?
Sure. So, I mean, the early shock was going from Beirut to Montreal in every which way, although French was also a language that we learned in Beirut in addition to English and Armenian and Arabic. But the French and English helped in Montreal. So the initial temperature shock and like high-rise shock and all the things, that I had gone through already in living 8 years. But then in 1983, when I came down to Boston, one thing is if you live in Canada, because of the bordering kind of states, you get a lot of American TV. So there was like, Boston Celtics were my favorite team living in Montreal. And so there was a lot of familiarity, let me say it this way. But, ultimately coming to the US for me was more than just coming to the US, but was coming to MIT, only because by this time, MIT was even larger in my kind of imagination in my dreams, in the sense that I wanted to go to a place where this totally new field, the biological side of engineering, which didn't exist before the early 1980s, was being created, and I wanted to be part of that. So I was drawn to not only the academic excellence, but the pioneering nature of actually creating a new field. And so in every regard, in fact, I'll say embarrassingly, and I've admitted this not too, recently, that I was really naive, because when I did my undergraduate degree at McGill in chemical engineering, I actually only applied to MIT for my PhD. And that wasn't an act of arrogance, it was pure naivete. I actually didn't know people apply to multiple places. And I thought if I got in, I would do a PhD, and if I didn't, I was going to do a PhD. Now, in hindsight, now that I'm on the MIT side, I realize how crazy a notion that was, because there'd be lots of reasons why in any given year they don't take a given candidate. I was fortunate enough to be accepted, but I must say I had no plan B. I thought I was a good enough student that they would have to take me, and thank God they did, because my career life path would have been totally different.
Absolutely. I mean, you talk about imagination and what you imagined it to be, and I was, you used this quote in the past that I think is pretty, from George Bernard Shaw, which is, imagination is the beginning of creation. So you imagine what you desire, you will what you imagine, at last you create what you will. And I think this is pretty, central and pivotal for your, what ignited the creation process of Flagship, and, so basically starting from the future and working backwards. So can you maybe, as we are, can you maybe go through what inspired you to start Flagship, and basically the process of creation that happens at Flagship on a regular basis, which I think is very profound and is still very novel in your space?
Yeah, so I got involved in entrepreneurship a bit by accident, because when I was a graduate student at MIT, I had a chance encounter with somebody that turned out to be a great entrepreneur I didn't know, who told me about how he and a friend of his started a company in the late 30s, and then just listening to him and realizing that I was in a totally new field and I could do the same thing as he did. Just as a graduate student, I would have been 22 years old at the time. It really changed the course of my life, and it turned out to be David Packard from Hewlett Packard. And so I went into entrepreneurship with this notion that it's a way to create, totally new things, innovation, and that, mere mortals could do this. The regular people, he was a regular guy, regular people could do this. I didn't realize at the time in the 80s that immigrants were like a new concept, so there were very few startups that were being started by immigrants, that young people were not exactly thought to be the right people to do startups. I mean, it all changed in the late 90s. So from there, after starting a company, and then that company ended up growing, and I started a few other companies on the side, I got interested in the 90s in this notion of parallel entrepreneurship. In entrepreneurship, everybody studies serial entrepreneurship, people who start a company and then another one and then another one. And the reason they study that, and they say, well, you get better at it, you learn, etc. I kind of thought, well, why can't you do multiple companies at the same time? Why can't you create companies? And of course, this was a completely crazy thought in the 90s. I started doing it on my own by being involved in a few. And then I got the further notion, and this is what led to Flagship, that could you actually make creating of companies and conceiving of companies the act of a company, not a random group of individuals in this kind of, romantic, chaotic, improvisational version of entrepreneurship, which to this day is mostly what's used. And the reason I thought that is that I thought, well, look, this activity of creating companies out of nothing, startups, has been done the same way for 30, 40 years already. Surely at some point we will have done it enough times that we don't have to start every one of them like some new piece of art and new, almost like a game, as opposed to serious, professional, planful kind of activity. So Flagship was largely, in the beginning actually, Flagship's name was Nucogen, which I hate to admit because it sounds like a disease, but I thought it was a good name. So for the first 3 years we actually had the indignity of operating with the name Nucogen. It stood for New Company Generation, Nucogen, and that's what we did. We were set up to be an engine for new company generation. This was 99, 2000. That inspiration about how to do this as an institution was really kind of an experiment. And we've tried and tried over the years, over 25 years now, to get better and better at it. But I would say that there's ample evidence now that yes, you could start a company in a dorm, or you could start a company in a garage or whatever, but you can also start a company in a repeatable way as a team of professionals, and that's what we do.
Absolutely. No, it's, and I think the process that Flagship is, the process of company creation that Flagship is doing, and the way you almost industrialize it, kind of the process and the process of elimination, how you're seeding them, as well as you're creating. I mean, Moderna is one of the companies that emerged from Flagship, and it's pretty remarkable. And very few in the life science space. You were maybe the first one to have this type of approach.
Oh, in life science for sure, but in general, I mean, it depends on what this is. There's plenty of people since then that have started incubators and accelerators and a lot of things that are actually not quite what we're doing, in the sense that the original idea there is external. So in other words, it's more of a service provider, an environment in which these things can be done, as opposed to saying, no, actually, we are the founders, we are the contributors of the science and the management and the capital. That idea of integrating all of those, say it kind of still is a pretty, but you asked the question, let me just come back quickly to this notion of imagination. If you think you can create companies, many of them at the same time, repeatedly and institutionally, then you have to ask yourself, where do you aim this capability? And that's where the imagination part comes in. Because if all you do is create Me Too companies, except you do them more efficiently, et cetera, you have to ask yourself what allows you to compete. And in the first few years, we didn't have a good answer for that. And so we were starting companies that, while not Me Too, they were still using the cutting edge science, but not more. What we realized after a few years is that we need to go beyond cutting edge science. And you might say, well, what's beyond cutting edge science? Well, it's easy. It's cutting edge science 5 years from now. So cutting edge science 5 years from now is beyond cutting edge science today. So the question was, how do you get there? And that is a pure act of imagination. Like, we are, as humans, endowed with this ability to foresee, not necessarily predict, but foresee, describe, create a narrative around, if you could only do this, then it would mean that. And even if you don't know how to do it, still describe this attractive destination. I always tell people, if you want to be working on far out things, you have to pick destinations, not directions. Most startups pick a direction. And they pick a direction because it's the most sensible next thing to do. If you get in the business of picking destinations and then come backwards and say, how am I going to get there from here? That's the kind of innovation entrepreneurship we practice.
I mean, if we take, for example, Moderna, right? And just to actually illustrate what you're talking about what you're talking about, looking at the destination and working backwards, right? So Moderna is one of the companies that emerged from the Flagship Pioneering process. You are its co-founder, the chairman of its board. In early stages, what was the destination? Because you revolutionized the mRNA technology, and how did you lead its evolution over time? For a company like Moderna, for example.
So one thing I'll say is that we've now been involved in some like 115 or so companies, and we number them. So when they're born, they're born into kind of the embarrassing state of being a number. And the reason is because we want to, in the early stages, make it really easy for us not to continue. It turns out it's very easy to say, I no longer work for number 18, I work for number 19. That's not a big embarrassment. Whereas if you call it Excelsior or something like that. On the next nugget, it died.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of, so from day one we've done that. So Moderna was LS18. It was the 18th one of these that we did. We did not start out, at least our flagships work in this, asking the question, what do you do with mRNA? We actually started asking, and in every one of our projects start with a what if question. We were wondering, what if you could use the human body to make any protein drug you want? When you ask the question that way, regardless of how you're going to do it, you could think of, okay, well, how are you going to tell the body what you want? You could put a virus, you could put in a bacterium, you could engineer cells and put them back in. You could do any number of things. You could have an extracorporeal device that you put on that starts infusing a drug. Or you could start thinking about, okay, well, how does the body's cell know how to make a protein? And can I bring those molecules in? So among a range of different ways we thought about doing that, mRNA caught our attention because there'd been some work done on it. And at the time, by 2010, which is when we started, summer of 2010, asking these what if questions, it had been basically dismissed. There'd been a lot of work done in the area, and basically it turned out that if you take an mRNA molecule, synthetic mRNA molecule, and stick it into a human cell, all hell broke loose. Basically, the cell thinks it's a foreign object, which it is, and reacts the way it does to a virus. Ironically, many viruses are RNA viruses. That is the only other time our cells see these, so therefore they react very aggressively like they have a flu. Well, what we started wondering is, okay, well, what's causing that and how do you overcome it? And we looked at the literature and we saw that there had been some work done by this group at UPenn in making chemical modifications, but that it wasn't enough to do this in animals or in humans because the degree of attenuation of the immune response was not enough to be able to do that. And that's why the kind of funding for it had dried up and whatever little companies had been started basically didn't get anywhere. We thought, okay, well, what if we put in enough money to actually overcome that? Now, we didn't know you can, hence the kind of phased process we have because we early on want to do the experiments. Then we started thinking, well, which part of the body is going to make the protein you want? Is it the muscle? Is it anywhere? Is it? And we pretty quickly realized you have to get these RNAs into cells and into cells that are good at producing protein. So the liver became an area. So all of what I'm describing to you were kind of acts of imagination because we had no lab work at the time. We were just saying, okay, if you think you can do this, by the way, we also had parallel efforts in other approaches to doing the same thing. The RNA one started kind of lending itself to questions we could answer. The key thing of our process of inventing is not only to imagine what would be good if it only could work, but the experiments needed to show it can be worked. If these experiments take 5 years and $100 million, we don't work on it. If these experiments take a couple of $1 million in 9, 12 months, those are the projects that we will be attracted to. So these are the things that we learned. You asked the question, how did it evolve over time? Well, it turns out that relatively early on, we found chemical modifications that could make a huge difference over what had been tried before. So we filed patents on those. We found that you could actually get things into, for example, liver cells in a very directed way, at least for liver, and this LMP technology that had also been tried before for other molecules, siRNA molecules, we could improve upon those. And so bit by bit, we started building the pieces needed to believe that you could do this for any protein. And then the rest kind of played out after that.
Yep. And here I'm just going to go maybe a bit fast forward on this Moderna story, and it's more from a leadership standpoint. I mean, you were involved in the evolution of this company during one of the most tense crisis or health crisis we had in history of mankind. How what do you think was the key to basically lead through those times of crisis? For the company in front of health challenges, production challenges, supply challenges, supply chain challenges, so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's kind of almost it's a blur a little bit in the sense that we were caught up in a moment where I mean, in a weird way, I had lived in a place where people were shooting each other and throwing bombs at each other in 1975 for about 9 months, and so it's not like I hadn't come close to the seeming arbitrariness of who gets to live, who doesn't get to live, that we saw in the pandemic. And so I hadn't felt physically quite that worried about life as I had when I was in Lebanon. But most people who live here have never been exposed to that level of kind of like you go to a store and it turns out that one of these people who used to work there has passed away because they had whatever chronic condition. So I'd say that had an impact on the degrees of freedom we had. In other words, a lot of times people ask us, how did you decide to work on this? Well, we worked on this long before any government asked us to work on this, but we worked on this because we knew that our platform uniquely could produce a new vaccine in a tiny fraction of the time it would take for normal technologies to do so. And we thought, boy, by the way, that is of no use in normal times. In other words, nobody is looking for a vaccine for CMV in a month. But in a pandemic, that's the unique time. It's almost like, I tell people, it's a little like developing a new umbrella. Well, if it's pouring, it's a lot easier to develop a new umbrella than if you're in the middle of a desert and you're trying to figure out what to change, except it rains, once every few years.
Exactly.
So it was that. But also, I'd say we had a fantastic team led by Stefan Bancela, CEO, Stephen Hogue as head of R&D. That core nucleus, which had built a 700-person organization and importantly platform, was a very big deal for us because we already had gone through the kind of the development cycles of doing not only science and technology and automation and manufacturing, but we had multiple vaccines we had actually tested in humans already before COVID came. Most people don't realize that mRNA was not tried for the first time by us in COVID. It was tried for the first time by others in COVID because they'd never worked on mRNA. We had worked on, we'd done 9 other vaccines
before that
through phase 1. So that helped. And then I'd say, just the fact that we were able to forge these partnerships with the US government, which was a big deal. This Operation Warp Speed helped a lot. Just a lot of resilience that the moment has a way to focus the mind. And, we were lucky to have some extraordinary people who did extraordinary work to make this happen.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's remarkable work that was done and in times of stress, for not just the population, but I imagine for the leaders of a company who was actually working on vaccines and so on and so forth. So definitely the achievement is very remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, we haven't even had the time yet because it's been one thing after the other since because you can't, if things work, then you have to keep doing it again. So we've done an RSV vaccine now, a flu vaccine that'll come out soon. There's a cancer vaccine that we're advancing, which uses the same technology, but now goes after individualized cancers in people. So we haven't really taken a step back and looked. But if we did, I'd say probably among the most remarkable achievements was going from ever having made hundreds of doses of an mRNA anything to 1 billion in a 9-month, kind of 12-month period. That is its own journey, which really is a credit to the technical and manufacturing and quality people we had. Because if you told me of all the remarkable feats, is it the design, is it the making, is it the clinical testing? All of those were pretty remarkable. I mean, nobody's ever done a 30,000 subject trial of anything in a matter of 3 months that I know of. I mean, it's just, and we did a 30,000 patient, subject trial. All of that aside, the manufacturing was technically, as an engineer, unfathomable. I mean, I've gone to the moon and back. I don't know what is harder, but it really, and the fact that it worked is, to this day, I jokingly tell people if you study engineering or other fields, there's this thing called Murphy's Law. And Murphy's Law is anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And any time you do any new design project, you got to remember Murphy's Law because it'll always bite you.
Yeah.
I tell people somehow Murphy was on sabbatical, was on vacation, because anything that could go wrong didn't go wrong.
Didn't go wrong.
And I have no explanation for that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think luckily he was on holidays.
Exactly, exactly, for all of us.
So I read the last annual letter that you wrote about Polyintelligence. I thought it was very interesting, and I would love to tie it in on the next big frontier on biotech and artificial intelligence. So obviously Polyintelligence, artificial intelligence, and biotech, have been kind of playing together for a long time. It's not a new thing. But what do you think is the next frontier for the biotechnology sector?
Well, your audience certainly would have known about AI, certainly would know about biotechnology, the interface. It turns out that the notion of polyintelligence in the way that we use it, and in fact the word polyintelligence, if you did a Google search 3 weeks ago, you'd get like 50 hits. And because people have not thought about this type of a multiplicity of forms of intelligence in the way that I can very quickly describe now. So, human intelligence in our brains, we think, is like artificial intelligence. But as the name suggests, and as is physically the reality, these two things have very little to do with each other. I mean, we can say neural networks metaphorically, but there's no neurons in artificial intelligence, and therefore these artificial intelligence systems are not connected. It's not like there's hundreds of millions of cells connected, 10,000 to 10,000 others of each other to try to get things done. The way the brain processes information, the amount of energy that it uses to do remarkable things is incredibly different than AI. So I would argue that AI and human intelligence are two quite different things. What is interesting, however, and therefore there's a lot that human intelligence can't figure out about what AI is doing, and AI is busy trying to figure out what human intelligence is so we can have artificial general intelligence, which to me is not a major milestone, but anyway, people are chasing it.
Yeah.
What is much more interesting to us, given the fact that we work on natural systems, is the degree to which we should think about nature as its own form of intelligence. Intelligence meaning encoding of information and know-how that exists in the DNA of every living species, and that essentially allows it to adapt, to survive, to thrive. And if you think of that as intelligence, yet a third form of intelligence, then what's interesting is humans have been trying to figure out nature's intelligence for a long time, hence the example of Da Vinci that we give, because that's what he was clearly obsessed over, is how is nature doing what it's doing and what can we learn from that?
Absolutely.
Of course, he had no idea DNA exists, he had no idea any of how cells work, but we now do more and more. But we don't have the respect for that operation as a form of intelligence. And we're fascinated by some human-created intelligence in AI. If you equate those three things, nature's intelligence, machine intelligence, and human intelligence, and you realize they're all three different, what becomes interesting now, what's going to be possible for the first time, is humans using artificial intelligence to decode nature's intelligence. Actually, artificial intelligence and nature's intelligence beginning to figure each other out, even while humans may not understand either. And there's reasons for that, having to do with just the way our brain deals with complexity and just having massive number of different components and keeping them all straight. Like, we're really good at keeping a few things straight, but we're not that good at explaining things with thousands of moving pieces in them. So I would say, as much as humans invented mathematics in order to help them understand the nature around them, and it lent itself to relatively simple versions of nature, but not the complex versions of nature. Likewise, I think we've now invented a technology that'll help us now better understand the rest of nature's intelligence, and that is just beginning. And I think thinking of it that way, thinking of the new tools and the new capabilities at the intersection of these three different forms of intelligence is what we call polyintelligence. And I think it's going to take some humility in humans to realize that they're surrounded by multiple forms of intelligence. I'll give you an example, viral intelligence. How is it that a virus like SARS-CoV-2 can overcome the immune system's attack of it globally, so that at any given time, no matter what immune system it sees, there's a variant of it that overcomes it? Well, that's a form of intelligence. It's embedded in the way that the virus works. It's not the way our neurons do it, but boy, is it capable of doing things that neurons can't do. Humans can't overcome on their own. We invented mRNA to be able to tell a human body what to go after. We're doing the same with cancer. So it's to me anyway, it's a different perspective on the role of AI, HI, and NI as they now cooperate and coexist. And it's going to take adaptation of all three, by the way. Each version is going to adapt to the other, because bad things will happen to each other and good things will happen to each other. So we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah. Well, it's a very interesting field. I mean, it's still evolving, but I think the part where you need to have the humility to not believe that what you're working on, or the type of intelligence you're working on or using as a tool is going to be the master of all the intelligence. I think that's the key, to be able to have that kind of, upward sloping, growth in terms of the problems you can solve and the knowledge you can build.
Exactly. And look, one of the other things to keep in mind is that in nature, all innovation has happened by a relatively straightforward thing: variation, selection, and iteration. And if you apply variation, selection, iteration on other things like human thought, like consumer products, like financial markets, you essentially you can explain most of the innovation that we've seen.
Exactly.
We think it's humans who kind of came up with this brilliant new idea. It actually isn't. It's just variation selection. We call it trial and error in humans. If you have a good system to capture trial and error, you get, Edison knew this. So if imagine computational trial and error, computational encoding of these things as now a new tool. We saw in chess, we saw in Go, the machine playing machine versions were doing things that it would have taken, it's believed, a very long time, thousands of years of human games to get to that level. Well, what if we did that with science? What if we had the ability to do 1,000 years of human-led experimentation in a fraction of the time? That's the moment we're in. That's why I kind of view this fascination with artificial general intelligence, which for some people is an important thing, as a kind of a really early waypoint on where we're going. This is going to be superhuman intelligence, super nature's intelligence, super machine intelligence, meaning we will constantly be getting the ability to do more and more. Question becomes, who governs it, who harnesses it, who safeguards it? And really it's going to be about humans, I think, to actually take that on. Because at some level, there's this interesting question that I don't want to get too philosophical, but is where does the conscience sit? Right? What is conscious and what is able to try to put safeguards, etc.? Well, I think humans have that prerogative. Maybe we'll get to a point where the nature's intelligence and the artificial has its own way of creating safeguards. But for now, at least we as humans have to take this on.
Yeah. No, I agree with the point on the conscience and kind of the safeguarding, which goes back to kind of the ethics of it. But not only the ethics, is the direction it follows, kind of the guardrails, so on and so forth. It's a very exciting space, but I agree with you, we're in early innings, very early. And I think, it depends on where we take it, because, it's still a tool, or kind of, this is something that is going to work towards a destination, not just work on its own. And so the human piece and how it decides to lead it or push it forward, I think is going to be crucial here. And I mean, this is what we write as we speak. That's what's happening that's what needs to happen at the moment.
Right.
I'm going to switch a bit gears. We're going to just go back last year to the commencement speech that you've done at MIT, which was great. I was there despite the rain. It was a great moment. And so during that commencement speech, and you spoke quite, you spoke about the immigrant way, about your journey as a first-generation immigrant, and about an outsider coming to the US. And I just wanted to actually take another lens here. Could you maybe explain how that immigrant way and that immigrant identity is central to the breakthroughs and the innovation that has been part of your journey, being Flagship Pioneering and other companies that were created subsequently?
Sure. So I don't think I was consciously doing this, but having looked back over the last few years as kind of what's the common vector through some of these things, I realized that my immigrant experience, starting at 13 years old, and for that matter, even my past generations of my family, which has been forcibly immigrating constantly, running away from one risk to another, has kind of shaped one aspect of what I'm doing, which is this: if you physically immigrate to a new place, then you are facing kind of elements, dangers, unknowns that you're actually not prepared for. Often the language is different, the customs, you fear police, you fear law, because you just don't know how you're supposed to operate. And also nothing is owed to you. Really, really important thing. Nothing is owed to you when you're not native, right? And so if you some people get lost from that and they get kind of left behind. But if you put up an effort, you get education, you put up a fight, you adapt, you compete, and you actually start figuring out how to be, that experience of physical immigration actually turns out to be a really good precedent to innovation. I've come to view innovation as just intellectual immigration, in the sense that you leave the comfort zone of what you know, You go into a place where people make fun of you because you're saying things that other people don't believe. You persist, you adapt, you make it much more understandable, and you get proof points to say that, hey, no, this can be done. And at some point, you define the new reality. So it's like immigrating to where you want to go, not where you end up going.
Yep.
And so creating novelty, creating new, like even startups are just that. It's a mechanism of creating new territories that you could then occupy. I do think that that immigrant experience helps one, let's say, accept the unknown in a very different way. Because if you have to leave the comforts and go to some place that's strange and foreign, you get used to that, how to deal with unknowns. And I would say when you're innovating or starting companies, there's so many unknowns that people who are innately not fazed by that have an advantage. Now, do you need to have physically immigrated to be really good at starting companies? No, or innovating. But boy, do you need to actually have the same mindset. And that's why I partly think that in this country, where you have this mixture of immigrants and people who are born here, the immigrant mindset absolutely catalyzes and shares that perspective. And I think the element of that is key is this, don't be afraid of the unknown, go there because there's value there. So I think that's how I've come to view the whole thing.
And do you think in this, in this analysis that you have done, or kind of the comparison that you do you think the immigrant mindset here is really a risk-taker mindset, whereby you're willing to go outside of the comfort, outside of the known, to go into a destination of unknown, where you are taking risks to be different, and you're taking risks to be the outsider, so on and so forth, and that risk appetite to leave your country to go to another place of knowledge is what defines, what makes innovation happen?
Yes, I would say though that it's not as much an intrinsic thing, because most people I know don't intend to immigrate. They end up immigrating,
of course,
because of life circumstances, sometimes forcibly. And so it's not as much risk appetite as opposed to a forced learning of how to exist with risk. So I do think that if you're thrown into the deep end and you learn how to swim because otherwise you're going to die, that, is that a swim appetite? Or is it that you were thrown into the deep end and you had to figure it out? I think that immigrants are thrown into the deep end and they have to figure it out, and they realize it ain't so bad.
Yeah.
And then they might actually, when they confront it again, be okay with it. And in fact, some people, and I think that's unfortunately the disease I'm plagued with, I seek it. I look for places where, we can actually take advantage of the risk to discover value, because most people just won't go there.
I understand. It's a good kind of reframing that you're doing on the concept of risk taking.
Because some people, like gamblers, are risk takers.
Of course.
And I'd say very few immigrants are gamblers.
Yeah.
If anything, you can be conservative, but you could learn how to not be afraid of risk.
Absolutely.
I guess that's the way I would look at it.
Yeah. Let me ask you on risk, and obviously we've been talking about your successes, who are actually pretty numerous. And I would love to ask you, could you maybe share a time where you felt like giving up? And how did you find the strength to keep going in front of that adversity?
I've been involved in starting companies in biotech since 1987, and that's 38 years now. And along the way, there's been hundreds, not tens, of situations where I didn't actually know if the next day, if the next week was going to actually go my way. Some of which would have been fatal, economically fatal, career fatal, etc. And so in those moments, what I was trying to figure out, first of all, is you don't want to come to that moment having not already foreseen that moment. One of the things that I learned early on is to kind of, again, use your imagination to create the worst case scenario, live it, and then when it actually comes closer, it's not unfamiliar to you because you already had seen the movie because you made it up in your own mind. Most people avoid picturing either their death or the death of what they're working on.
Yep.
I think as an entrepreneur, you have to have the ability to go there. You cannot have it intimidate you, because otherwise, over time, it grows more and more and more worrisome, as opposed to, you imagine, like, okay, this is what could happen. and here's what I'm going to do as a result, and yeah, it's terrible, but this. So face the abyss and stare it down is something that you need to be able to do. That's one. Two is you also want to have constantly a lot of different options. So it's a little bit like, you know, maybe I guess playing chess. Early on, you have a whole lot of different things you could do, and having a point of view of what those are and carrying forward that optionality every step along the way, super important. And at the very end of a game, you don't have that many options. And so similarly, having an option-based mindset of thinking through several scenarios at any given time and keeping them alive, move after move after move, that's an important thing. Why? Because then you don't get into a binary situation where that's it, you're out of opportunities and options. Lots of cases where things I've done have failed, lots of cases where there's obviously opportunity to give up, and you know, it's really more about having a point of view of why you're even doing this. And often people are doing this because what they're doing can have impact, and that impact far outweighs the calamity of the moment if things are not working out. You could say, look, this many years into it, the downside is somewhat mitigated based on the fact that I've diversified, yeah. But in the beginning, I hadn't diversified. I was doing one thing, and that thing came very close to death. I always tell people that you know an entrepreneur who's done this for a while when they start worshiping secretly at the altar of chance. Because there's so many things that happen, including what I told you about during COVID, that you cannot explain any other way than things went your way, and that's chance. That you can do everything you do to control the variables, but the rest of it is chance. And you just, you know, you get, you know, people use the word resilience and, you know, this and that. I think you got to be motivated by the impact you're trying to create and accept the fact that you might fail. If you avoid failure, there's no chance you'll have success. That's called luck. It's just lottery. So I don't think there's any way to avoiding that.
As Albert Camus says, you know, sometimes, you know, you need to accept the absurdity of some parts of life.
Yeah, exactly.
Randomness, absurdity, luck,
yeah,
you know,
exactly.
one of the above.
Exactly.
So, you know, actually, I'm just going to switch a bit gears on, you know, because you're a proud Armenian. You are the second most famous Armenian in America after the Kardashians. You know,
Yeah.
I don't think you're going to do a TV show soon.
No.
So, and I know you're proud of it, and I want to spend some time on it. And as an Armenian-raised entrepreneur, and obviously knowing the history of Armenia, it's like, how has that influenced your work? And, you know, you coming to the US, you know, how that part of your life has influenced what you have done, you know, in your career and in your, you know, in your education and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So look, everybody is a proud something, and I think it's the best thing is to actually be proud about it, as opposed to kind of, you know, either be ashamed of it or kind of, you know, or not care about it. So in my case, I come from Armenian background, nationality, ethnicity. And so the history of Armenians, which goes back 5,000-6,000 years that it's kind of documented, is a pretty rare event. There aren't that many people who've been kind of persistently around. So if anything, we're like, you know, weed, it's really hard to get rid of us, I guess, is over history. And boy, has there been situations which have tried to get rid of us. I mean, recently, 100 years ago, even now, there's some real dangers. But if you go back over hundreds and hundreds of years, I mean, basically, the geography, where you know, the South Caucasus, where Armenians are ethnically or historically from, has been a pretty tough crossroad of enemies and adversity. So the fact that the kind of history has shown ways to survive. One of the things that I realized as descendant of genocide survivors, which I am from both of my parents, they both went through the genocide after World War I or during World War I. You realize that one thing we are is survivors. And this is not unique to us. I mean, obviously, Jews have survived lots of historic adversity. Many other people have. But in our case, it's kind of defined us because I'd say our historic celebrations and songs and everything is all about surviving. Actually, not victory, not beating other people, because we don't have any examples. But it's largely just, you know, in fact, it's, you know, I tell people sometimes that it is not a surprise that in Hebrew, a toast is l'chaim, which is to your life. In Armenian, to toast is genatzed, which is to your life. In French, you say avot santé. In English, you say cheers. In lots of other languages, you say other things.
Mm-hmm.
But in those two tribes, life is basically what you toast to. It's not an irony. In my view, it's not a surprise. So the way it shaped me is, it's kind of like an against the odds thing that this has persisted.
Mm-hmm.
Armenians have been around long enough to develop their own culture, their own language. The language of Armenians goes back to the absolute roots of Indo-European languages. If people keep redefining the tree, but basically at the very root is a separate branch so this has got nothing to do with all the other languages that have kind of spurred since.
Mm-hmm.
Big deal if you think about it. So, by the way, difference is not advantage. Difference is just uniqueness. It's up to you to make it an advantage. But otherwise, at least it's unique. So I've grown up with that. Because I was born into a family that was one generation after this genocide, there was a lot of survival kind of like impetus, which probably caused us to, emphasize education, emphasize the struggle, etc. Then about 30 years ago plus, Armenia as now a country became an independent country from the Soviet Union. It was a basket case of a country. It was poor. It was just left thrown out of this previous Soviet thing. And so a lot of people in the diaspora, none of whom are from Armenia, I'm not from Armenia.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my family hasn't been on the current land of Armenia for 800 years, because most of them were from what is Western Armenia, which is Turkey now.
Mm-hmm.
But essentially, to go back to try to readopt that culture, that those people, and try to help them, which is something I've been involved in for 25 years now, all of that gives meaning to my life. If I was Croatian, I would have been probably doing it for Croatia or Serbia or Albania So I have no kind of false sense of, again, distinctiveness as being some purpose, some goal, some advantage. It's just it just happens to be what I am, and so I pay attention to it.
Absolutely. No, it's I hear you from the standpoint. I'm Tunisian born and raised, and I share the same feeling, but as you said, it's just an identity.
Yeah.
And actually, what reminds you of home when you're here? When you are in the, what makes you feel home? What makes you feel Armenian when you are in America?
It's interesting. So I've been blessed by having in Boston a set of friends, mm-hmm. pretty much all of whom I didn't know when they were in the Middle East, but all of them had immigrated from the Middle East, so similar upbringing. And like when we get together, there's like 60 people. and essentially none of us have parents here. Mm-hmm. And all of us essentially adopted each other as cousins, even though we're not. And so all of our kids grew up together.
That's wonderful.
And that has created a mini community. There's a very famous, probably much more famous than Kardashians or I or anybody else will be, Armenian author in the American history, which is William Soroyan. Mm-hmm. Very, very famous author. He wrote about things that have nothing to do with Armenians, but he had a strong ethnicity as well. And now we're talking about 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. And he has this famous kind of piece that he wrote in which he describes two Armenians meeting in Russia from different places. And he describes very poetically that, because we've been chased around the world and we've been dispersed, he says, when two Armenians meet anywhere in the world, see if they won't create a new Armenia. Mm-hmm. He meant is that little micro-Armenia around their conversation, their past, their history, that moment of creating little Armenias when you interact with like-kind people, that is the best thing, kind of like, for me, that reminds me. It's not physical things, although we have our own church, and it mm-hmm. goes back to 300. It's like first national church. There's a lot of symbolism and there's a lot of artifacts, mm-hmm. but to me, the human interaction is probably the most genuine of other people who carry the cultural DNA, not just the physical DNA, mm-hmm. and that's what brings me home.
Mm. So basically, the community is home.
The community, yes.
And we're just going to go, and I'm going to go to a broader question here. And obviously, you are in the intersection of innovation. You received the award of great immigrant by the Carnegie Corporation. I mean, you went through MIT. You are working, on all this, on the biotechnology world. What steps can America take to foster an environment where immigrant founders and scientists thrive? How do you think about it?
Yeah. I mean, look, I think, so we've gone through some periods where the immigration topic has been politicized, like everything else, actually. I think most people feel like it's the most politicized issue. Well, it's not. Everything has now become politicized. So I think it's just, so we need to be careful about that. But if you just look at America's kind of history, I think if you're American, you're an immigrant. It's just a question of when.
Absolutely.
And I think we tend to forget that, because generation after generation of people come here, they then become American, and then they look at anybody new coming here like, well, wait a minute, what are you? And this was brought home to me, and at the commencement address in May of last year, I kind of relayed the story. And the most searing memory I had in the early days of when I came to MIT is that MIT has this famous infinite corridor where, student space is like the backbone of kind of the communication or physical kind of passageway at MIT. So people go through, as you know. I remember very clearly in the beginning, I used to walk up and down this corridor once in a while, and there was this poster, and it was a Native American, so Indian chief, with a finger sticking out saying, "Who are you calling foreigner, pilgrim?" And the notion that we, Americans call new people foreigner, even though they came in and took over another people's land, just says to you we are the product of immigration. And I think immigration, from a biological sense, is just this regenerative force. It is cultural regeneration, it is mindset regeneration, and I think that's what makes the US really thrive. No doubt about it. By any metric, it is the single thing that we have, I'd say, more than just about any country. I haven't studied if there's a country that is more run over by immigration wave after wave after wave. So we clearly need immigration for innovation, entrepreneurship, but we also need immigration to strengthen our labor force, to actually have a vibrant community of workers. As people move up the economic kind of ladder, they don't want to do certain jobs, and how we can think about an orderly way in which to be able to meet the needs of people who rely on those service providers, etc. I just think we need to, rather than shun it or be kind of stigmatize it, we need to just kind of define it as part of being American, and then put the right frameworks and incentives and safeguards. I also think we need to make sure that people who are second, third, fourth generation Americans actually realize that they are as dependent on this as the newcomers are on them. I call this kind of just general notion. I feel like every generation, there's Americans by choice and there's Americans by birth. And if you take one or the other out of the equation or emphasize it too much, you don't have the right balance. I think we need a combination of Americans by choice, which means they wanted to be here, they fought to be here, they're sacrificing to be here. And that, I think, is an important part of what this is my own personal view. Obviously, I'm biased in that I'm part of the American by choice, but I do think that everybody is American by choice some generations ago.
Absolutely. No, and I think this actually resonates quite well with actually the name of this project. I mean, it's called New Colossus for a reason. It's the poem at the base of the Statue of Liberty in New York, who actually sings, the praise of the immigrant coming to the shores of America, looking for a new beginning, and actually deciding, to be American by choice, not by birth, right? And I think, that kind of, it ties well into that. I mean, that's what the poem is about. Last question, because we are running out of time. And, so you've been here, so you came here in 1983, we are in 2025. And, you have built, 100 plus companies, you have achieved a numerous number of things. If you look back in time to when you arrived here, what advice would you give your younger self arriving to the United States?
Of course, you always wish you learned more things, different things, you knew more people. There's always more of everything you can get. But I always thought that the gift that education gave me is the ability to learn, not what I learned. And if anything, in the fields I've been in biology, in technology, what we have learned over time has shown how little we knew. And so if I had maximized how much I knew, it would have been kind of a commodity very soon after. So I'd say first, I did get that out of this experience, but I would tell a younger version of me to just obsessively learn how to learn. And so that's one. I'd I'd say second, I didn't have this in mind, but I now do. And so I've been teaching at MIT for 16 years. I taught at Harvard Business School for 3 years. And among the things I try to get across is the mindset of an entrepreneur.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when I started, I didn't think entrepreneurship can be a profession. I suggested it could be 30 years ago, 1994, and I've been pushing that since, including today. I still am trying to make entrepreneurship a profession. And the mindset of entrepreneurship, which is kind of what I call paranoid optimism, is this balancing act between optimism, which is a force of your imagination and your ability to work to get things done, with a level of paranoia that you don't misunderstand your imagination as though it's reality, and to keep testing. That balancing act, I could have known even earlier, but again, these are all things that you learn over life and then you transmit it to other people so they get an advantage of it. I must say, I'm sure I've done lots of things and I know I have done lots of things that I could have done better, but I've been really fortunate, for which I have a huge amount of gratitude, that the circumstances I was exposed to and the journey I've been on, and I hope to continue being on, is filled with opportunity to learn, adapt, contribute, express gratitude. And so I haven't really looked back and said, if I had just done that, and I actually don't wish for anything I don't have. And so if I did, I'd probably look back and say, what would I have to do to have even more blank? It's just not the way, I do live in a kind of a future backwards world. So in everything I do, so in a lot of the philanthropy work we do, try to envision what should exist and then make it come to be. And when you do that kind of like future backwards time travel, you don't spend a whole lot of time thinking, I wish I had done this in the past, because I have no influence on what I could have done in the past. I have a lot, you write the future if you're willing to. If you're not willing to write the future writes you. And that is, it dictates what you can get done today, because you leave the future for the future, you just work on today. That's kind of how I view it.
I think that's a good, that's an excellent conclusion to this conversation. Thank you so much, Noubar. This was great, and I think this was extremely insightful. Yeah, great. Thanks, Noubar.
Well done. Good job.